Hello there friends and welcome. Today we are finally back at Elden Ring thanks to the release of the new DLC Shadow of Erdtree, and we'll be revisiting my favorite and also the easiest build ever, the classic full armor shield and poke spear turtle build. This is a playstyle that combines both the ultimate defenses with amazing offenses as well, as it lets you just stand there while blocking most of the boss's attacks and also poking them into submission with your trusty spears, capable of great frostbite and also most importantly bleed damage. And the best part is how amazing this build is through the entire game, from the very early game, also late game including the classic Malenia super boss, and most importantly all of the DLC bosses as well, especially the final DLC boss, which is a breeze, as most of its attacks are blockable. And all footage you see here is fully up to date for the new DLC release. So without further ado, let us get into the easiest build possible ever, the Shield Turtle Spear Poke. First, I wanna cover up some basics of how the playstyle works, also its strengths and vulnerabilities. But if you prefer, you can just skip to the how to set up your character for the early and late game build sections. The Shield Turtle Poke playstyle is very simple, as it just requires you to hold the block button while also pressing the light attack button to poke at the enemy while fully blocking their attacks. Don't bother using the heavy attack button because that will leave you vulnerable to attacks. Now, it's important to note that only a few weapon types qualify for this, mostly thrusting weapons such as spears, also great spears, and even rapiers. But the spears of course have the highest range and reach of them all. And keep in mind that halberds will not work with this interaction. Now a very important stat to consider is your shield's guard boost value. The higher it is, the less stamina it will cost for you to block attacks. And on the DLC, enemies have pretty high costs for their attacks. Before all the shield nerfs, you could easily get this value to 100, which meant no stamina lost on blocking. Nowadays, this isn't really possible anymore, but we can still reduce it to minimal amounts. Lastly, let's talk about guard counters. Whenever you block the enemy's attacks, you can follow up with a guard counter by pressing the heavy attack button. It's easy to notice because you hear a little sound effect and then counter the enemy. Guard counters are especially good because they deal increased damage and can break the enemy's stances very easily. However, because they are somewhat slow, ideally you only wanna guard counter common enemies, that is, enemies that bounce off your shield with their attacks because it leaves them open for a counter attack, or enemies with slow attacks. You pretty much never wanna use guard counters against bosses because they have very fast attacks and will punish you for that. Well, unless you wait for the end of their never-ending combos, but this takes forever and kinda defeats the point of constantly poking at them with your attacks while blocking with a shield. Now, I just wanna give you some tips on how to enhance your Shield Turtle playstyle to the max, especially for the new DLC enemies. First, the most important of them all is that you do not want to be spamming your attacks constantly. As I mentioned before, you cannot reduce stamina cost to 0 anymore when blocking attacks. Therefore, ideally, you want to attack 3 to 4 times before waiting for your stamina to regenerate, especially against bosses because otherwise you will soon run out of stamina, they will break your guard and you will take damage. Don't forget that your stamina will regenerate even while blocking, it just slows down a lot. But because we have such high guard boost values, you can easily take on enemy attacks while waiting for your stamina to recover, if you don't wait for it to become very low. Which is why I say, do not spam your attacks constantly. There's a second benefit to not spamming loads and loads of attacks at once, and it's the fact that some enemies, especially most of the new DLC bosses, they love dancing around the battlefield to try and flank you, that is, attack you from your sides. If you're locked on them and keep attacking again and again and again, they will punish you by going to your side quickly and attack you in retaliation. However, if you time your attacks properly and are locked on the enemy, you will then keep moving towards them just fine, while still retaining the ability to attack and of course blocking these nasty, let's say, side or flank attacks. As far as vulnerabilities of the build, you only have two really. First is grab attacks. Grab attacks are extremely damaging and unfortunately you cannot block them at all. You have to dodge them. Thankfully, almost all of them are quite telegraphed, including from the DLC bosses. So they're easy to avoid once you get the hang of it. Lastly, you should be wary of area of effect attacks, because they usually hit all around you and you only have a shield at your front. This kinda depends on the boss though, but at the very least the final boss of the DLC has very blockable area of effect attacks. Also, to avoid enemies that have overhead attacks, so usually they come flying at you from above, just be sure to back away a bit, so you can then block with your shield as the enemy will hit the shield instead of your head. Now that we know how the shield turtle poke playstyle works, let's finally get into how to properly set our character up, for both the early game, assuming you are starting a new run, or of course the late game and most importantly the DLC. Now assuming you're starting the game, the first step is to hunt your ultimate weapon, the Cross Naginata Spear. It has high range, great damage, can be infused with Ashes of War and even found extremely early. In my previous shield guides I've already covered the locations of these early game items step by step, so for now I'll keep it short and simple. But you can easily rush to kill it by just going with your horse and avoiding enemies for the Cross Naginata. By default, the Cross Naginata will deal bleed damage only. Bleed is especially useful throughout the entire game, to be fair. And all of the DLC bosses are also susceptible to bleed. It's the easiest way of dealing high damage to them, because whenever you bleed the enemy, you will deal damage relative to their hit points. So it will always deal a very nice big chunk of damage, including for bosses. Early on, you won't really have ways of upgrading it to increase more bleed based on your arcane score, nor points to spend in arcane. Therefore, ideally, you wanna get the Ash of War Ice Spear, also found early, and change the Cross Naginata's affinity to Cold. This way it will deal both Frost and also bleed on hit. Both deal damage relative to the enemy's hit points, and Frost also even increases the damage the enemy takes during its duration. So even if you won't really have high scaling based on your stats, you will more than make up for that by having Frost and Bleed. The rest will come from upgrading your weapon. Later we'll upgrade this into an even more powerful variant with higher damage and scaling of course. But for most of the early and even some of the mid game, a Cold Cross Naginata is more than enough. The second step is finding a great shield. Now at the beginning of the game you won't really have enough strength for a great shield. So ideally you can always go with, for example, the Brass Shield, which is farmable from starter enemies. But even the starter hitter shield from Vagabond is good enough, as you really want something that already starts with 100% guarded damage negation for physical, which means you won't take any physical damage at all when blocking. Before you have enough strength for the Great Shields, however, it's very important to get two items. First, the Great Shield Talisman. It does not increase your guard boost, nothing really does anymore outside of the shield itself and upgrading it, but will reduce the stamina cost when blocking attacks. So in a way it does stack with guard boost, although it's not the same property. Still a must have nowadays because we want the least stamina lost possible when blocking. And early it will be a great help because early shields don't have the best guard boost. The second item you want is actually a spell, Scholar's Shield. It only costs 12 intelligence, so pretty easy to get early, and essentially provides a similar effect to the Shield Talisman we just covered. It will also reduce the stamina lost when blocking attacks and will stack with the Shield Talisman and of course the guard boost value of your shield, for the least stamina loss possible even early game. For a staff to cast our shield spell, I recommend Demi-Human Queen as it's found early and only costs 10 intelligence. For another important early item, be sure to rush for Radagon Sword Seal to increase all of your physical stats by 5, which of course helps tremendously early on to meet requirements of gear and so on. While it does increase the damage you take, early and mid game it doesn't really matter. For the late game, especially the DLC where enemies deal loads of damage, You don't want this, but you also won't need it anymore, because you'll have more stats from leveling up. As you level up and get more points into strength, we can also finally equip a Great Shield. You have two options, either Eclipse Crest or the Distinguished Great Shield. Both have the same guard boost value when not upgraded, but Distinguished is way easier to find, as you can easily buy it from the merchant close to the Hermit Merchant's Shack Grace. And yes, you can also reach this area even early. Chances are you probably already know how to do it if you've played the game before. Meanwhile, Eclipse Crest requires you farm the Mausoleum Knight enemies, and has somewhat low drop chance. One of the most important early items to find is the Winged Crystal Tear effect for your Wondrous Physic Mix Flask. It's one of the most powerful effects in the game, and I'm quite surprised it has not been nerfed, despite all the nerfs we've had since release. Essentially, it increases your equip load by an absurd amount. For example, my character here is already overloaded when equipped with full heavy armor, also your weapon and shield. Meanwhile, by just drinking the flask, there we go, we are now at light load and can even fast roll. This effect will only last 3 minutes, but trust me, it's more than enough for almost any boss, including all the DLC bosses, and even normal exploration, because graces and shortcuts are very common in this game. Do note that for normal exploration, if you're running out and getting encumbered, you can just unequip your armor. For normal enemies, so PvE, this doesn't matter at all, because you'll just be blocking 100% of their attacks, and they're very easy to defeat with a shield build. And for bosses, you'll always have enough duration. Alright, now let us get into how to level our character. I decided to finish this character at level 150, which is definitely a good starting point for the DLC. And I actually started as an astrologer mage, just to show you it can be done, but ideally Vagabond is the best. The first thing to do is get points so that you can actually equip your Cross Naginata spear. You'll have enough strength already, but you do need 20 dexterity. Don't forget you can use Radagon's seal to make up for the stat requirements early on. Second, you wanna get 12 intelligence to qualify for the Scholar Shield spell. Third, you wanna keep increasing your strength until you can equip all of the Great Shields. The new best Great Shield in the DLC requires 49 strength. For the main game, 48 is more than enough. After that, you'll want to increase both your Vigor and also Arcane. Vigor is not that needed until the DLC where enemies hit super hard. And for Vigor, 60 is definitely enough, as that's essentially the soft cap. Meanwhile, it's also the same for Arcane, 60. If you're not using Godric's Great Rune for a huge +5 to all stats, I mean it goes away on death, but with a shield build you can easily survive. Way more than most other builds, of course. You can keep your Vigor around 55, then close to 60 Arcane and so on, or mix and match it. If you want a level for the DLC, you'll have more than enough points. But after you get 60 Vigor and 60 Arcane, I would really just start dumping points into Endurance for higher stamina. Once again, the main reason we didn't get Endurance for equip load is because we have the Winged Crystal Tear effect, which more than makes up for that for the whole game, including the DLC. It's much better to only start dumping points into Arcane once you get the Seppuku Ash of War or the Wet Blade that lets you add the Occult affinity to your spear. There's no point in Arcane before that. Now let us cover our final gear setup, including with DLC options. For weapons, we have the Occult Cross Naginata. As I said before, once you get the Seppuku Ash of War, feel free to change your Naginata from Cold into Occult. Now, there's also another weapon that stands out in the DLC for this type of build, and it is the Blood Fiend's Sacred Spear. While you cannot change its Ash of War, which is kinda crappy to be fair because Seppuku is really good, it already has very high Arcane scaling, also very high blood loss build up, 122. Meanwhile, the Occult Cross Naginata is 98, And it also has higher damage, right? So the Occult Cross Naginata has 946 with this character that has a few Scarred Erdtree boosts. Meanwhile, Blood Fiends is 1044, a good increase. Last but not least, by virtue of being a great spear, it also deals higher stance damage on hit, which means it's easier to break the enemy's stance and get a critical hit with it. On the other hand, the loss of Seppuku is kind of annoying. I mean, at least you don't have to reapply it during boss battles, but most of the DLC bosses have second phases where you get enough time to reapply Seppuku. And honestly, I do think the damage with Seppuku is somewhat higher, because once you trigger Seppuku, you'll also proc some gear bonuses like the Lord of Blood Exultation, even before attacking the enemy while prebuffing. Honestly, you can use both weapons just fine. I personally beat the whole DLC just with the Occult Cross Naginata, and it was a breeze. The Sacred Spear does require less dexterity though, 12 instead of 20, which means later in the game you can kinda put the points somewhere else if you prefer. So that's an advantage, definitely. There's also a normal spear, the Bloodfiend's Fork, but it's kinda disappointing compared to the Occult Cross Naginata. Now what about our shields? I've already covered the early game options, but for the upper part of the mid game and also some of the late game, the Fingerprint Stone shield is still an amazing option, as it is the shield with the highest guard boost value for the main game, 86 when fully maxed, while also boasting great guard damage negation for most elemental and magic sources. For the DLC, however, we do have a new ultimate shield for blocking, the Verdigris Great Shield. When fully upgraded, it has 90 guard boost. That's 4 points over the Fingerprint Stone shield. Does this matter? Yes, it does. The higher your guard boost, the less stamina you'll take. And remember, nowadays you cannot increase guard boost by anything anymore. It's only based on your shield's base value. Considering you'll still further reduce your stamina from the Great Shield Talisman and the Scholar Shield spell, Verdigris is definitely a very nice upgrade, even if its magic and elemental resistances are somewhat lower than Fingerprint. It will more than make up for that with the new ultimate guard boost value. You can get it, well, one of the ways, the easiest way, is by defeating the Invader Moor NPC. Now what about armor options? Only the helmet truly matters, and the white mask is definitely the best choice, as it will increase your damage whenever someone nearby suffers from bleed, either the boss or yourself by applying the Seppuku Ash of War. I'm pretty sure this helmet is still missable, but it's not the end of the world if you don't get it. You can just go with whatever else you want, including even for fashion. For armor pieces, ideally you want the armors with the highest damage negation possible, especially for the DLC and the enemies with broken damage. The Bull Gold set is still amazing, but we also have the new Verdigris armor set, which comes from the same NPC that drops the shield, Invader Moor. Verdigris and Bull Gold are kinda similar, but Bull Gold has higher strike damage negation, while Verdigris is higher slash and pierce. But it's only a very, very slight difference anyways. Go with whatever you want. Your talismans do matter a lot, so let's get into that now. The Great Shield Talisman is a must-have, as I mentioned before, plus the Ring Sword Insignia followed by its upgrade, the Rotten Variant. Both will increase your attack power with successive attacks, something very easy to do on a shield and poke build, as you won't have to keep spamming dodge. Besides that, the Lord of Blood's Exultation should also increase attack power when bleeding, just like the White Mask, and they do stack. And for the last slot, you have a few options. The Green Turtle and its new upgrade for the DLC, the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman, are quite good because they increase your stamina recovery speed. The higher your stamina regen, the easier it is to keep on blocking enemy attacks while still poking the enemy yourself. After all, you do still regenerate stamina when holding your shield, so the faster it is, the better to ensure your survivability. Besides that, you have the damage negation talismans, so Dragon Crest Great Shield for a huge boost to physical damage negation, followed by the elemental ones depending on the boss you're fighting. Besides that, another interesting choice for a lot of the early game, especially PvE content, is the Curved Sword Talisman, which will increase your guard counter. It's just that, as I mentioned before, it is very hard to get guard counters against bosses. For common enemies though, it's another story. Something else you can do is use the Ritual Sword Talisman, which increases your damage while your hit points are at maximum. For a lot of enemies and some bosses it does work, but for the DLC bosses though, because they have split damage, physical and elemental, and you can't really guard against all elemental damage, this talisman kinda loses its worth fast. Now what about your spells? And this is also very important. Scholar Shield, as I mentioned before, followed by, at the very least, one of the Fortification incantations. You have one for each element: Holy, Fire, Lightning, and so on. They cost very little faith, only 10, so any build can get it. And their effect is quite strong, because they increase your elemental damage negation by a lot. For example, we have 53 against fire, but by just casting the Flame Fortification, we now have 69, a very big increase, considering how high enemy damage is on the DLC. And yes, it is at the DLC that these shine the most, because, like I said before, all the DLC bosses tend to do physical plus some source of elemental damage. The best ones are Flame, followed by Lightning and also Divine for Holy. As a matter of fact, the higher your Holy damage negation, the easier it is when fighting both the main game and also the DLC final bosses. When you have your Fortification spell plus a powerful shield, you will be avoiding most enemy damage. And for the small damage you'll take, you can also benefit from the Bestial Vitality incantation to regenerate hit points. It only costs 12 faith, so still manageable for most builds. If you want to increase your faith higher, you can also get 15 for the Flame Grant Me Strength spell, which does increase your stamina regeneration and physical attack power. It's just that as a body buff, it will clash with your Fortification spells, as you can only have one. Plus, Fortification is rather long-lasting at 1 minute. Flame Grant Me Strength is half that, 30 seconds only. Anyways, I would definitely get 10 faith at least for the Fortification spells, they really help in the DLC. Lastly, let's talk about our Wondrous Physic Flask. As I mentioned before, the Winged Crystal tier, to essentially ignore equipment load, even when equipped with a great shield and heavy armor, followed by the Green Burst Crystal tier to increase stamina regeneration. The effect is quite strong, it's actually higher than 10 extra stamina per second, so it works wonders on a shield poke build. Now let us do a quick section on how to properly pre-buff before boss battles to fight them optimally. First, drink your Wondrous Physic Flask, as it will last 3 minutes. Then, with any Sacred Seal, cast Bestial Vitality if you have it for regeneration, followed by whatever Fortification spell, depending on what element type the boss deals. Then switch to your staff and your shield and cast Scholar Shield. Followed by the Rallying Standard buff from the Commander's Standard weapon for extra damage and damage negation. Ultimately, just change into your Cross Naginata and go for Seppuku. You might as well heal the damage you took, and feel free to enter the boss room and fight them. Now, if you go with the Verdigris Great Shield, because you can't really apply an Ash of War to it, you won't be able to cast Scholar Shield and combine it with Seppuku, because Seppuku will require a free hand when combined with the Verdigris Shield. Second, if you decide to go with the Bloodfiend Sacred Spear instead of Cross Naginata, you won't need to cast Seppuku, of course, because you can't apply an Ash of War to it. This might appear to be long, but you can actually do it quite fast before bosses, and it does make a huge difference. Because honestly, the more buffed you are before doing a boss battle, even with short duration buffs, the easier it will be to win. Well, alright friends, so this was it for our ultimate easiest build Shield Turtle Poke Guide. If you found it useful, as always, please remember to like, subscribe, and also consider becoming a channel member if you can. I highly appreciate your support. Thank you for watching, and see you next time, friends, with more fun Elden Ring builds fully updated for the Shadow of Erdtree DLC.